Okay, hi again, everyone. I'm back. Um, yeah, we're going to talk about volume rendering for minutes was the time slot. Sorry. Yeah, something like that.
Yeah, that's what I got.
Maybe a little bit less time. Um, and so it's a pretty big topic. And I probably could spend the whole time just on YT, but I wanted to start off with just mentioning some other ways to do some volume rendering outside of YT that are, extensions to YT that you might find useful. So first off, and I'll probably talk about some of this a little bit more tomorrow. I won't go into too much detail, but so YT Napari is an extension for Napari. Napari is a um, built as a multi-dimensional image viewer, generic image viewer that's used a lot in the biosciences for analysis of cells and cell structures. And it has a really nice plugin ecosystem. So it's really easy to write plugins to load new data or to do analysis from within Napari. And there's really a lot that you can do with Napari. And so I wrote YT Napari to help you get data into Napari more easily. And so effectively, it's more or less just fancy wrappers around routines in YT to produce fixed resolution arrays, which is what at present is what Napari can load. So the basic usage of YT Napari it's kind of like this if you're working from a notebook. There's also other ways to interact with it, but I won't touch on those now. But so you load in your normal YT dataset as usual. You start a Napari viewer, and then from YT Napari, you start the scene, you initiate the scene object. And this scene is kind of like the go between Napari and YT. So you add selections to the scene object, it goes and adds it to the Napari viewer. So you can add regions to a given viewer from a data set, and these all this region, looks like the arguments more or less to like the ds.region object, except you're supplying the parameters that you want to in terms of like the resolution of the image you want to create. And then some other arguments that control the look in Napari. But so this is adding a density and a temperature layer. And if you run that, which I already did because it takes a few seconds, what pops up is this over at the right. This is the Napari window. We have a temperature layer and a density layer. So this is like a composite image of the two. If you click this button down here, switch to a 3D view, which you can rotate. So this is a maximum intensity projection. There are other rendering options, but for most things, I don't really have not found a very good use for them in like astrophysics or like geophysics data. Like I never wanted to do a minimum intensity projection. But maybe you have a reason.
We did it the same way.
It's,
Okay.
yeah. But yeah, so yeah, that's all I wanted to say about the party. I'll go into a little bit more tomorrow in section where I'll be. But I find it really good for like, quick explorations, because you have to load in the fixed resolution arrays, you're limited to what you can fit in memory, so it's not going to have the detail you might get with the full YT volume rendering API. But if all you want to do is like quickly look at max intensity projection, look around, and kind of check out the features of your data. Pretty good. Or structured grid data, no particles. Nice. I haven't found a good way to load it. But anyway. So next extra plugin, YT-IDV. So YT-IDV is a separate package built for YT for interactive rendering. So it uses OpenGL. It has both an interactive and a headless mode that you can use for rendering. Directly renders all of the YT gridded structures. Can do max intensity and integrated projections. Has some functionality for custom transfer functions that doesn't work super well. We're kind of working on still, but yeah. And then most recently, though, you can now do direct volume rendering of data that's in spherical coordinates, which is an example of that. It is so you do have to still be able to fit your fields in memory in this, so you're still limited to smaller data sets maybe. And then it can be a little bit tricky to install. So Ubuntu, for example, more recent Ubuntu's have defaulted to the Wayland graphics windowing system, which currently does not work with YTIDV because one of the dependencies, don't need to get into it, but basically you need to restart your sessions to use the X windows.
Sweet. I didn't know that.
I forget which of our dependencies it is. It's the
Glue, maybe?
game. It's like, yeah, one of
GLE.
seems to work pretty well on my Mac, as far as I can tell, in terms of the interactive stuff. Headless rendering, I have not gotten to work very well on my Mac, mainly because it relies on installing other packages, which are kind of tough to install on Mac. So I have had some success installing those via Conda, but then it runs pretty slow. Windows, I have no idea, never tried it. So if you have a Windows machine and want to try it, let me know how it works. Cool. So let me actually show you what this looks like. So first little script is just loading the density field from isolated galaxy. So all you do is you load in your YT data or data set, create a YT-IDV rendering context, give it a height and width for the window that you want, tell it that you want it to be interactive with this GUI argument. And then for simple things, all you have to do is call this add scene and with your data set in the field you want to add. And you do that. And get your rendering in a second. Yeah, so now we have, this is a maximum intensity projection. Very interactively. And you can do lots of things, changing color maps. And you can change the projective integration. Sum and weight across rays. And create outlines, see the structures of your data set. Yeah, so that's fun. And then the other example I have in here, the script is a little bit longer, mainly because, so this is for loading the data set that's in spherical coordinates. Most of the script directory volume rendering 03, most of it is just building a data set, and it's actually in load AMR grids, using just a variation of that sample script that I showed you before, but now we're telling YT that it's spherical coordinates, and we have a data set to play with. But the actual loading into YT-IDV is pretty much the same as before. You just start a rendering context, give it the data set and field, and then this is just adjusting some of the look. So it's turning off the log for the field. On that one. And this script has a bunch of other things that you can play around with if you want. Domain is just telling it the extent of the spherical domain that you want to load in. So so the way this works is by loading the data that lives on the grids, which lives in spherical coordinates. So it loads them into textures for OpenGL in their native spherical coordinates. And then during the ray tracing, shoots rays through the volumes and then calculates the spherical coordinates along that ray and then goes and samples those textures. So it's not doing any pre-interpolation or anything. And you get out your data. You can add the grid outlines too. Cool. So yeah, so if you have data in spherical coordinates in 3D, I would definitely be interested in trying out loading it in YT-IDV, because like I don't have that many test data sets for this. Like I've been using it with some of my geophysics data sets, but those are not in spherical, they're in geodetic coordinates. So I still have to do a transformation, even if it is just some kind of a minor transformation. But it would be fun to have more data sets that are 3D native coordinates to try to load in here. See if it breaks. Yeah, that's that.
Can I say something about YT-IDV? So you're not talking about it again tomorrow, right? So YT-IDV also has the ability to have an IPython, not Jupyter, but IPython prompt associated with it. And it has various filtering commands. So you can do things like add filters to your data and have it cut some things out and whatnot if you want to highlight certain regions. But you can also modify and add annotations and what. It's really fun. Is the main thing. I really like YT-IDV, and Chris has done some pretty good stuff with it.
And it'd be fun to have more people using and developing it. So if you're interested, get in touch. Yeah, okay, so on to volume rendering in main YT. So the docs have a pretty good overview of everything. And I'm basically just going to walk through parts of this in slightly simplified manner. So if you were just getting started, though, I would recommend reading through this. But as it is, let's just get into it. That too. No. Okay, so what goes into volume rendering? So there's this nice little graphic on that docs page that shows you all the elements that go into volume rendering. So you have overall scene object, and inside your scene you have other objects that live there. So the sources are the underlying data sources that get rendered in your 3D scene. And you add those sources to your scene. And then you also have control over camera and the lens for that camera. So the positioning and the orientation of it relative to your data sources. So you can kind of view from different angles, move it around. Yeah, and so the data sources, there's a number of different data sources. So this is a map of what those data sources are. So it's actually like a class inheritance map. So you don't necessarily use all of these. Like you probably are not going to use the render source directly unless you're implementing a new source. But same for the opaque source. But so all of these sources over on the left that are children of the opaque source class, these are all ways to add annotations essentially to your scene. So they're like adding lines and point sources. Useful, and we'll look at it later. And then the volume sources are the things that actually map your YT data fields using a transfer function to the end result. Yeah, so I think I said it. So volume sources. So the volume sources are like, kind of the meat of volume rendering, right? Or what we're trying to actually do. And so to do volume rendering at all, you need to define a transfer function. So I'm just going to run this code real quick, and then we can look at what pops out here. Back up. So we get this plot out here. So y-axis is this alpha parameter, x-axis is the field that we're going to be plotting. So this line here is output of the profile object for the density field. So it's a distribution of density values in your data set. And then all of these Gaussian peaks are mapping ranges of that data to different colors and opacity levels. So this is our transfer function. This tells us when you shoot a ray through the volume, when that ray encounters a certain value of a field, this is how it maps that value to a color. And those colors are accumulated along the ray to give you the final image that you get. And 99% of volume rendering is figuring out what to use for this transfer function. And it can be very frustrating, very hard. So don't feel like it's your fault.
One thing to interject is that with other types like maximum intensity, integration and whatnot, the values are not necessarily view dependent, the order dependent, I mean, whereas with the transfer function, because there are alphas and whatnot, you could in principle get serious view dependence things. And so obscure and whatnot, which is good and bad.
Right, so how do we actually set this transfer function? Let's actually look at what this code is doing here. So we're loading in our data set here. This is the Enzo64 data set. Could be any data set if you want to substitute one that you have locally. And first thing you do is create our volume rendering scene with this YT create scene function. give it a data set, lens type, and this will go and create a volume source, default volume source for you. I think just using the density field if it's present. If your data set doesn't have a density field, you need to actually specify the field here or you'll get errors. But default, it'll pull out the density field for you and initialize a volume source. And so you can pull out a reference to that by extracting the first element of this scene. This will be up for now. You look at what that is. It's a volume source corresponding to a region in our data set. Currently does not have a transfer function assigned. None. So the kind of easiest starting point for the transfer functions is to use some of the built-in automatic construction methods for transfer functions, which are accessible at TFH, which stands for Transfer Function Helper. And so if you go source.tf.set, this gives you the min and max range that you want to apply a transfer function to. If you say set log to true, this means that you want to work in log space. Gray opacity equals false. I think it's just telling it that we want a color matched one, or is there more to it?
There's more to it, but I forget what.
Yeah, me too.
It's something about whether there are separate alpha channels for each color. Can't remember which way it works. So I never changed the default.
Yeah, and I think that this is the default maybe. Yeah, and then if you go source.tfh.plot and give it a profile field, this is telling it what to go and create a profile of for our data plot. And then you'll get out that plot that I just showed. But we haven't actually done any ray tracing or volume rendering yet. So let's do that. So if you wanted to do it and save it to a file, you would do scene.save, give it a file name. But since we're in a notebook, we can do a show, and let's see what we get out. Rain.
This is the rendering dance you have to do.
And we get almost nothing. You can kind of maybe see stuff there. And if you, the first time you go through this, if you get a nice looking image, or if you can see anything at all, it will be doing better than I do most of the time. Usually I do this and I see nothing. It's just a black screen. And I'm like, what did I do wrong? What do I have to go fix? And so first thing you should always try is adjusting the contrast of the final image. So you can do that with this sigma clip value. And so you call sc.show, give it a sigma clip value. And this is just doing it for a range of contrasts. And we can scroll down and we can see we're getting brighter and brighter and brighter. And you'll notice that went really fast because it's not actually doing the ray tracing again. It's just a post-processing contrast correction to the final image. So before you go and start trying to edit your transfer function too much, just try that just to see what it does. And I think the dots used a value of 6, which is pretty good. And then another very useful function, this save annotated function. You give it a file name to save to, and it will save the volume rendering along with this nice little representation of the transfer function. That go pretty quick. And then this is just a markdown cell where I have imported it just to show it to you. You'll also notice that went pretty quick because it did not re-render, but this function, as well as a couple of the other functions in the volume rendering scene, interface, a lot of those functions have this render or argument, and this is just telling this function that we don't want to render again. We're fine with the image as it is. So it'll go pretty fast. If you set this to true, it'll re-render everything, which you need to do sometimes if you modify things. Yeah. Cool. So that's and so yeah, that's like a nice way to actually show your transfer function next to the image you've created, having to separately show spot here. Okay, so all of this was using the default, what happens by default with the transfer functions. So let's talk a little bit about modifying it, using it yourself. And yeah, so if you want to do that, it's kind of the easiest starting point for that. So that you start off the same way where you create a scene, pull out the source related to that scene. This is directly telling the scene which field we want to volume render for, and telling it that we want to take the log and work in log space. Same bounds as before, but because we're doing this manually, we're not going to use our transfer function helper automated system. Instead, what you do is you create a yp.color transfer function that you initialize with the bounds that you want to use. Because we're working in log space, unfortunately, you have to remember to take the log of these values. Easy to forget, maybe something that we should improve. But for now, you got to take the log. And so this will give you an empty transfer function to which you can add stuff. And the simplest thing to add are individual Gaussian peaks. So you can do that with ef.add Gaussian. And so this, you give it, hold this up again. Right. Yeah. So this add Gaussian adds a peak centered on this data value. So this is the log of that data value. So we see down in our plot, centered at this value, we have this peak. The width of this peak is controlled by this width parameter. And then the height value here is effectively the RGB and alpha value for this peak. So yes, and then after you add that Gaussian, you then have to go and update the source attributes that correspond to the transfer function. So you have to go into source dot transfer function helper tfh dot transfer function, set it equal to the transfer function that you just created, and then also copy over the bounds that you've used. And if you want to, so yeah, so you can kind of do this iteratively and just add more and more Gaussians. For example, we can add another Gaussian centered somewhere else. And now we have another Gaussian, different width, same height. Actually, this a little bit. Yeah, and so now when we go and render, we should be able to see. You can see this rendering where we have the greenish features and then the inner. So this add Gaussian, you have to specify the color. I did not end up writing an example for this, but there is also a sample color map function where instead you specify the location and the width of your peak, but then the color map from which to sample, and it'll then pull out the sample for you, or the color for you from that color map. So if you're adding a bunch of Gaussian peaks and you don't want to manage the colors individually, you can use this to simplify that. Yeah. Cool. So that's kind of like the general overview of volume rendering. Main limitation is that in YT it is Cartesian only. So if you have non-Cartesian data sets, you can't do volume rendering out of the box. But I will say I've had a lot of success in just interpolating my data to Cartesian coordinates, creating a new data set, loading that into YT, and then doing the volume rendering. So this is one example where I've interpolated a 3D seismic model, which is latitude, longitude, depth beneath the Earth's surface, interpolated it to Cartesian, and then add that with all the generic data loaders to YT, and then do the volume rendering. And then all of these other things you see on the surface of the Earth, these are all opaque sources that I mentioned before. So these are Let's see, we have some tectonic boundaries in red and blue. The green dots are recent volcanoes of the last 10,000 years. And then you have the US states. And so all of those are in flat shape files in terms of latitude, longitude that just get projected to 3D and then added to the volume rendering scene with source using opaque sources. Yeah, so you can show a lot. And more recently, I've simplified all that a little bit with YT X-Array, which kind of automates some of that interpolation for you so that you can take your data in spherical coordinates, apply some transformations on the fly by grid, and then do that volume rendering, and it's kind of lowering the amount of effort in doing that. Yeah, probably talk a little bit about tomorrow. Yeah, that's kind of all I had planned for this. A few minutes if anyone has any volume rendering related questions, or sit for a second and you can try some of the stuff in the notebook, or we could move on.
Thanks, Chris.